What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're back, baby. It's the best armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated armies from large competitive events over the course of the prior weekend. It's been a little while since we've done one of these things, but don't get me wrong. I've read all your comments asking for when this series. Before we jump into the list, I do want to level with you. First of all, I am on the road coming back from the Onslaught 40k Tampa Open. I live streamed that over the course of the weekend, a 5-round, 8-player per team event featuring 11 teams, almost 90 players. You can go check out my coverage of that event over on the live tab on my channel. Huge shout out to everybody who hung out with me over the course of the weekend. I really appreciate it. So for that reason, I'm recording in a hotel room and on my headset microphone rather than my fancy microphone that I have in my studio, so the audio might sound a little bit bad. Now, about the series as a whole, I think there was a downturn in interest of competitive 40k towards the end of the last update cycle because the meta game was getting fairly stale. So these videos didn't really get that many views. They do take an enormous amount of time between collating all of the lists, compiling all of the ones that I want to talk about, analyzing them thoroughly, recording the video and editing it. The whole process to create these videos is somewhere around 8 hours, and due to the time crunch of getting them out before Monday morning, usually when these videos went up on Monday, that was when I went to bed, somewhere around 5 or 6 a.m. And to be honest, it wasn't particularly healthy or sustainable. In addition to that, it's also extremely difficult to do these videos when I am traveling to events, which I'm doing more and more often to cover them. So to preface this video, in order to try to get these videos out on a more realistic time frame, I'm going to try to cut some corners. So it's not going to be quite the same level of editing as I usually pride myself on this channel. What we're going to be doing is going through the raw lists themselves. I'm cutting out a lot of the steps where I go through and create slides with the list and edit them all together and rewrite them. So let me know down in the comment section if this format works, if it's something that you're interested in continuing to see, if I'm able to continue the series. But with that, let's dive into this week in Warhammer 40k. It is the weekend of November 1st through 3rd, and we saw some big events go down this weekend. Now, some of the big headliners of the weekend were team events, and we are going to be talking about just singles events today, but we'll likely go through some team results in my live stream shows over the remainder of this week. But we are talking about singles events today, and we saw a couple large, close to major level events, including things like the Mid-Mo Maelstrom and Gem City GT. And as we dive into these lists, we can see that the Gem City GT is one of the headliners here. Adeptus Custodes and Astra Militarum both had 2 wins on their record this weekend, both of them at the Gem City. Adeptus Custodes had 2 total wins, both the Gem City and the Dark Sphere November GT. Astra Militarum took down the Gem City GT as well as going undefeated at the Mid-Mo Maelstrom. Now, both of those Astra Militarum lists are including, wait for it, Tempestus Aquilons. So that unit that has been controversial for the last couple of weeks since the release of the data sheet is doing fairly well, and we will certainly talk about them when we get to the Astra Militarum lists. Chaos Knights also basically coming out of left field, an unexpected result, because I know a lot of players are pessimistic about the position of Chaos Knights in the metagame right now. They still, however, had 2 wins, the Atomic City Warzone and Ligaea Primus solo tournament. I hope that I'm saying that correctly. Now, Chaos Knights were not the only Chaos faction to do well at the Atomic City Warzone. Death Guard also looking pretty good over there as well. Now, moving on to Space Marine factions as we go into the armies that won single events. Ultramarines took down the Geek Shack. That was streamed over by our friends over at Wargames Live, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Gem City GT, where Astra Militarum and Adeptus Custodes both went undefeated, was streamed by our friends over at Tabletop Live. So in addition to the streams that I did over the weekend, which of course you should go watch, go check out all of those channels if you want to see these lists in action. Now, Dark Angels also took down the Dark Sphere November GT, so we had 2 Space Marine undefeated this week. Pretty good for a faction that saw both buffs and nerfs. Dark Angels did see some hefty nerfs to a lot of their core faction-specific units, but Ultramarines obviously huge buffs, and now look like they are going to be a staple once again in the competitive metagame. World Eaters also going undefeated at the Gem City GT. That was a huge event, by the way, 90 players, so we had multiple undefeated at the end. The Winchester GT was taken down by none other than Orks. Leagues of Votann took down the West Allotment at War. Adepta Sororitas took down the Risky Rollers Open. Now, interestingly, that was a 44-player event, but it rolled 7 rounds. So only a single undefeated at the end of that one, of course. And the Adepta Sororitas player that did end up taking this one down, as we'll talk about momentarily, was 7-0. So that is pretty impressive to begin with. Last and certainly not least, Chaos Space Marines retaining their position as a contender in the metagame, taking down the Curtonian Total Carnage. Now, before we dive into the list themselves, we're going to have a sponsor time. Coverage of the Onslaught Tampa Open is brought to you by The Standoff, presented by Crossroad Games. The Standoff is a long-running 40k grand tournament with a focus on both hobby and competitive play. While the event has been running for years, 2024 will only be its second year running as a multi-day GT. Not only will the event feature a 5-round, up to 72-player tournament, but it will also provide prizes for sportsmanship, painting, and even a trivia contest. This wide breadth of support for multiple aspects of the hobby is quickly making the Standoff a staple for Northeast US 40k events. This year's event is running November 16th, 2024 at the spacious Portland, Maine Doubletree. You can find the event rules and more about the Standoff in the links down in the video description. If you aren't able to make the event, it will be covered on this channel. So huge thanks to the Standoff for helping support this live stream coverage, and I'll see you there. Now, starting off at the Gem City GT, this is one of the larger events of the weekend, a 96-player event held over in Dayton, Ohio, here in the United States. And we're going to talk about many of the undefeated players from this event. First off, Adeptus Custodes. I think everybody is excited for them, and Fulgur Piles did go undefeated with a Custodes army. Fulgur was running a Talons of the Emperor detachment, the combined arms detachment featuring both Sisters of Silence and the standard Custodes. Now, this list in particular was focused very heavily on Blade Champions. It ran 3 Blade Champions, as well as a single unit of Custodian Guard, an Anathema Psychona Rhino, 2 Caladius Grav Tanks, 3 units of Custodian Wardens to attach those guard into, a single unit of Prosecutors, 2 units of Witch Seekers, and Inquisitor Kyria Draxus to jump into that unit of Custodian Guard. Now, it has been a little while since we've talked about Talons of the Emperor. Shield Host is definitely kind of the cutting edge of Adeptus Custodes detachment technology, but Talons of the Emperor has so many good stratagems in it that it is super hard to ignore. Now, obviously, there are some benefits for Anathema Psychona units and Adeptus Custodes units. They can kind of trade some of their stats amongst each other if they're within 6 inches of each other. Fortunately, the list does include that Anathema Psychona Rhino, which is, being an Anathema Psychona unit, able to trigger most of these enhanced effects that the detachment is able to provide. But some of the biggest things that this army includes are incredibly powerful stratagems that are good both on Adeptus Custodes units and on Anathema Psychona units, and can oftentimes affect both of them. This includes things like +1 to wound in the fight phase for Emperor's Executioners, Talons Interlocked for +1 strength in AP against a single target that you then must target, and Taloned Pincer, a reactive move up to 6 inches. Both of these can target up to 2 Custodes infantry units. One of them, if you choose to, must be Anathema Psychona, which means that you are most likely using those on things like your Witch Seekers if you have the opportunity to, but you don't have to. And that's one of the big benefits that Talons of the Emperor brings you. You can use these incredible stratagems on just the Custodes infantry if you really want to. It's just a simple added bonus if you are able to drop them on those Prosecutors or Witch Seekers. Now, moving on from there, we can continue to talk about Gem City GT and talk about our number 1 placing player, Wesley St. Hines, running Astra Militarum with a ridiculous 474 points scored out of a possible 500. An absolutely incredible result. Now, he did name himself on his list of Nemo the Fish. I'm actually not really sure why his list has listed as both his name and Nemo the Fish, which I assume is his real name, his given name that's on his birth certificate. His list is also themed as a UNSC infantry regiment. Everyone's got themed names as well, which is kind of cute. Hopefully he had them appropriately modeled as well. We could use some of the new Halo firefight models to stand in for our Astra Militarum units. But in this instance, Wesley was taking Acadian Command Squad, as well as 2 Death Corps Marshals, 3 Militarum Tempestus Command Squads, Gaunt's Ghosts, Ursula Creed, as well as Sly Marbo. The big thing that we don't see here is the inclusion of Lord Solar Leontis. We're leaving him at home for the opportunity to take one of the Tempestus Primes as our warlord. The big benefits that we get there is the ability to take Tempestus Scion units as battle line. And it's a cool kind of piece of technology within the Astra Militarum index where you have two pretty distinct warlord options, both of which shape your army. And I kind of wish this was something that they did more often through the indexes, and maybe it's something that we get in future codexes as well. It allows you to either take Lord Solar Leontis to get a heavy order and stratagem focused army that's very consistent and very relatively passive, or you can take this much more aggressive style of army that's able to take tons and tons of Tempestus Scion units and also use them to absolutely dominate scoring, because you can use them for secret missions like War of Attrition. Now that they have the battle line keyword, you can drop Tempestus Scions into your opponent's backline and almost automatically score that for huge points. Obviously, there are some downsides to focusing your game plan around secret missions now with the Pride and Nexus updates, but there's still definitely a lot of technology there. So we were running a Cadian Shock Trooper squad to run that Cadian Command Squad in. That's mostly to get a Master Vox for probably Ursula Creed, who can issue 2 orders per turn to infantry units. And we do have a lot of infantry units, 2 units of Kaddish and Jungle Fighters, 2 units of Death Corps of Krieg. These guys are going to jump in with the Marshals. They have a Krieg Medipack, so they're able to regenerate D3 Death Corpsmen back into the unit every one of your command phases, and then those guys will also get a 5+ Feel No Pain from the attached Marshal. When you're combining that with things like Take Cover, these guys are super tough to kill, and even if you kill them, they're going to get bonuses from Grim Demeanor as well, so they're still looking pretty hot, even if they're taking casualties. And then we can see these battle line units start to take shape. 3 Tempestus Scion squads to attach in with those Tempestus Primes. Looks like 30 total Tempestus Scions, plus we're adding on top of that the Tempestus Command Squads, adding additional special weapons, plus sustained hits, plus orders when they drop in. It's a huge amount of attacks with that sustained hits, with rerolls targeting enemies on objectives. These guys are excellent, especially at sweeping enemy infantry squads. As long as they're on the table, you're basically not safe as long as you can get depth struck on. So you absolutely need to screen very aggressively. And even if you do that, you're going to open yourself up to potential holes opening so that Aquilons can drop in and open up that space for the Tempestus to drop, or just being killed by the Death Corps of Krieg naturally. We also then have 3 Khazarkin teams as well, who can push forward and dominate the middle of the table in the early game in order to clear out those screens, because those guys do naturally scout. And then as we're moving on to the end here, 30 Tempestus Aquilons, 3 units of 10. Obviously, you can only take 10, so that's not that surprising. All of them with Sentry Flamers. They're going to be able to fire those things when they drop in for a D6 plus 3 shots. They can do that potentially in a wide variety of situations. The big benefits of these guys are that they are so flexible. It's absolutely insane. And when you're using them alongside things like the Gaunt's Ghosts or the Tempestus Primes, you even may have orders remaining in order to order them. Just the flexibility of this unit is crazy. You can 3-inch drop them onto an enemy objective, immediately drop a unit next to them, order them with, for example, +1 to hit, +1 OC to steal the objective away, even if they have a high OC unit on it themselves. You can order them with +1 save, so they're difficult to kill. You can rapid ingress them to steal objectives away so that people aren't getting secondaries, to block charges, which is, I think, one of the big ones that people are discussing right now. The big benefit of these is that they can do any of them. It's not necessarily that any one thing they do is spectacularly broken, but you have so much optionality with them, and then you're also adding on the fact that you can order them and you can recycle them back once they're destroyed because they have the regiment keyword. So these things combo so well with the army. Now, importantly, they don't get battle line because they're not Tempestus Scion units, and they also can't be joined by Tempestus Primes. So it's important to note that they don't get any of the synergies of the Tempestus Scion army. They're just a unit by themselves, but they are still what a unit. And obviously, clearly, it is catapulting them into some pretty solid competitive success already. Now, moving on, let's talk about Atomic City Warzone. This was a 40-player event held over in Washington in the U.S. We have 2 pretty spicy Chaos lists coming out of that one. The first one we're going to talk about here, because they also won a second tournament this week, was Chaos Knights. Lucas Troller going undefeated with the Chaos Knights. Now, I think that this is going to be a fairly standard army for Chaos Knights, although they do have a little bit of a Nurgle splash in there, which is a little spicy, although Nurgle is probably the best independent Chaos subfaction to drop in there. We're rocking the single War Dog Stalker, no enhancements on him. This is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 War Dog Brigands, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 War Dog Carnivores, as well as that Nurgle splash. So this is a sort of standard allotment of War Dogs, pretty normal stuff. We also have that Plague Bearer unit unlocking the 1 non-battle line demon inclusion in the army. That inclusion is going to be a Beast of Nurgle. These guys are just good objective holders or backline objective grabbers. They have enough 2 damage attacks that they can threaten some medium infantry or utility units. You can't really just leave them alone to do whatever they want. In addition, the Plague Bearers are also great objective holders. They're deep striking. They are 2 OC apiece. They also have locking objectives, so you don't necessarily need the Aura of Terror from the War Dog Stalker. Anyway, you can save a couple points there. And if you need to, you can leave them in Deep Strike, and they can act as utility later on. They're also really tough to kill. They're just T5 infantry with an invulnerable save, and which oftentimes some armies struggle to get rid of, especially because you're never putting them in a situation where they're supposed to take like any real damage. They're usually fighting your opponent's trash, and they are the kings of the trash fight. They will engage in the trash fight for basically the entirety of their existence. Now, speaking of Nurgle, let's go back to our ranking here, because we're going to also talk about the other undefeated player at this event. Trenton Bates went undefeated with Death Guard. Death Guard kind of got a new lease on life with this most recent update. They got a bunch of pretty important points cuts, and they are looking pretty good. Trenton was rocking double Biologist Putrefiers, a single Death Guard Chaos Lord, 1 Foul Blightspawn, 1 Malignant Plague Caster, a Tallyman, and Typhus. Tallyman usually in there just for some CP regeneration. The Malignant Plague Caster honestly has just a pretty good torrent attack built in, but can also reduce enemy speed coming at you, which can make it easier to sort of sandpaper out specific enemy units and then protect yourself from counterpunching. And for 65 points, the Death Guard Chaos Lord is actually kind of a baller profile. This guy comes in with 5 lethal hitting, strength 8, AP 2, 2 damage melee attacks. In addition, he pulses mortal wounds to enemies within contagion range of him at the end of each turn, which can end up stacking up to be quite a bit of damage if he's able to remain in combat for long enough. And he also gives his unit reroll hit rolls of 1, so he can even be used to buff up a Plague Marine squad if he really needs to. Kind of a lot of abilities and pretty solid stats on this guy's datasheet for an extremely efficient points cost. Now that's picking up 6 total units of Plague Marines in a combination of all of the different unit sizes that you can take them in. We have 2 units of 5 for 90 points apiece, 2 units of 10 for 180 points apiece, and just, I guess to be flavorful and also probably save some points, 2 units of 7 for 125 points apiece. Actually, just learning now that Plague Marines can be taken to units of 7, incredibly thematic, and it's one of the few instances where you can actually cut down on your model count to save yourself a couple of additional points on that unit. Carrying those guys to battle with 3 Death Guard Rhinos. We also have 2 Death Guard Hellbrutes to apply contagions at range, alongside 2 Fetid Bloat Drones, one of them with Plague Spitters, one of them with its Flesh Mower. So we have a melee-oriented version and a flamer-oriented version. These Fetid Bloat Drones are so important just as a pretty solid objective holder. They're relatively fast, at least for a Death Guard army, and they're tough to kill, with a high toughness value and pretty solid saves as well. And being able to push forward and either project contagions, hold down objectives, secure secondaries, all for a relatively low points is pretty nice. We also have a Mephitic Blight Hauler in there. This guy's a pretty interesting little inclusion. He's basically the same defensive profile as the Plague Drones. He doesn't fly, but he is also relatively fast and has more offensive punch, and gets +1 to it against vehicles, which is just nice. +1 unit of Nurglings for a little bit of infiltrating action. Very cool to see this infantry spam style of Death Guard army. This one is not including any of the Death Shroud Terminators that we typically see. We've even seen things like Mortarion start to bleed back into Death Guard armies. He's not making an appearance here either. We're just focusing on good old-fashioned Plague Marines, and it is working. Now, speaking of Plague Marines, let's talk about regular Space Marines. Moving over to the Geek Shack Open, this was a 30-player event held down in New Mexico. This one was streamed over by War Games Live, if you want to go check that one out. This was won by Colin K, who was running a kind of classic version of an Ultramarines Vanguard Spearhead. Now, this is an old-school style of army that we saw way, way back in the day. Basically, this time last year was when it was starting to get popular, and it has seen a resurgence resurgence now that Ultramarines have gotten their characters wildly improved. So we have an Apothecary Biologus with Blade Driven Deep. This guy can co-attach alongside Marnius Calgar. Since he's a chapter master, he can hop in alongside a big unit of usually either Eradicators or Aggressors and infiltrate up the table and potentially alpha strike your opponent on the top of the first turn. You can combo that alongside Captain Sicarius, who also gives his attached unit Scout, so they're able to move aggressively up the table. He also gets you a pretty solid reactive move, and comboed along with the Vanguard Spearhead's reactive move in response to charges is basically uninteractable by melee units, since he can reactive move 6 inches away, and then when they declare a charge, move himself even farther back for a CP. We also have a Shadow War Veteran Combi Weapon Lieutenant, so the first instance of a CP tax effect in the army, and we'll probably see a couple more. In fact, there is Uriel Ventress right there. He's going to give you a deep strike on one of your big bricks. It looks like we have a Centurion Devastator squad benefiting from that in this list, but he's also a second instance of a CP tax effect. Now, we also have 2 Company Hero squads in the army as well to attach those 2 captains into. Here's the Eradicator squad from Marnius Calgar to jump into. We have 2 Inceptor squads, 1 unit of 5 just to act as utility unit, and 1 unit of 6. That unit can make use of the uppy-downy strategic reserve stratagem that Vanguard Spearhead has to then use its 3-inch deep strike later on in the turn, so you can repeat that 3-inch deep strike multiple times. Very good for potentially dropping on your opponent really early in the game before you want to bring in those deep striking Centurion Devastators to really get some serious damage through. We also have 2 Scout squads and an Infiltrator squad for utility. Again, this is a pretty standard version of this list. We have seen it come into the 4 in the last couple of weeks, but it's definitely cool to see Ultramarines with a pretty solid army. Now we're moving on from there to the Dark Sphere November GT. This was a relatively large 64-player grand tournament, and it saw some pretty impressive results. We did have an X-0-1 result from Thousand Suns, but we're here to talk today about Dark Angels. Jack Payne went undefeated with a Stormlance task force running Dark Angels. Now this is honestly not too uncommon. We have seen a couple of armies like this do well in the past. It is pretty unique though. Stormlance gives you the benefit obviously of being able to advance and charge all the time forever. And one thing that Dark Angels do love to do is get super duper aggressive with their hyper tanky melee units. And one thing that can happen in the Gladius style of Dark Angels build is that you start to kind of wear thin their assault doctrine. You're basically dumping CP into your Deathwing, the Knight squads over and over and over again in order to actually get them into the fight. And you don't need to do that in Stormlance task force. Stormlance also has some benefits as well for some of the other unique units inside the inside the subfaction. Things like Black Knights, for example, but it doesn't look like we're actually running any of those. I think we are literally just running all melee infantry. Lionel Johnson also gets a huge benefit from this. He has a pretty good gun, but he would much rather be in melee, and being able to advance and charge all the time with that guy is a huge bonus as well.
A combination I also think is important to mention is the fact that Stormlance has access to a non-keyword locked reactive move as well. So you have the capacity to do things like reactive move Lionel Johnson or your other combat units into positions where they can heroically intervene or out of threat range of enemies that could potentially damage them.
So we're running Azrael in this list alongside Lionel Johnson, a Combi Weapon Lieutenant just as a utility unit, as well as a Judiciar. The Judiciar and Azrael are both jumping into 2 units of 6 Inner Circle Companions, so we do have a very aggressive fight firsting unit, so they can act as basically a bulwark against incoming melee. Lionel Johnson also bringing fight first as well, so he can also act to dissuade melee counterpunches because he can just jump in with a heroic intervention and clear them out. We also then have 2 units of Assault Intercessors with jump packs, 3 units of Deathwing Knights, even at their new points cost, still rocking triple Deathwing Knights over here, alongside those 2 Inner Circle Companions, as I just mentioned, 1 Scout Squad and 1 Infiltrator Squad to act as utility. Pretty interesting army. This honestly gives you kind of, a little bit of like Black Templars energy, just running a bunch of dudes up the table at your opponent. Definitely some creative stuff here, not the normal Gladius task force as we've been getting so used to seeing with Dark Angels, but it is cool to see a little bit of differentiation from this subfaction, and it is also cool to see Space Marines doing so well even after subfactions like this got nerfed and the buffs to Ultramarines. Now moving over to another faction that got huge buffs in the update, we're going to move over to the Mid-Mo Maelstrom run in Ashland, Missouri. This one was won by Astra Militarum, but we already talked about Astra Militarum today, so we're going to go to our second place finisher, Ryan Verbeck, who went 5-0 with Genestealer Cults. Now, this is a Biosanctic Brood Surge detachment, so the melee-focused detachment with bonuses for Aberrants, Genestealers, as well as Biophagus units. We have a Patriarch with Biomorph Adaptation to give him additional AP and damage on his melee attacks, putting up to a pretty impressive 3 damage apiece. We have a Sanctus in there. We have a Sanctus in here who's actually kind of an interesting tech inclusion. If he is equipped with his Bio Dagger, which is what we have right here, he cannot be overwatched. So he can go in to actually eat Overwatch from really potentially dangerous units. You can think of things like Rubric Marines that would normally be torching your Genestealers or doing significant damage to your Aberrants on the way in, and the Sanctus just says, no, I'm not into that. We're just going to turn that off and engage your units so they can't fire Overwatch. He's also just a stealth load operative infiltrator for just a couple points, which is a nice inclusion to have if you're trying to score. We have 3 Abominants. One of them has Predatory Instincts to allow his unit to infiltrate, as well as 2 Biophagi in order to grant their attached unit the buffs that the detachment brings. Those guys are most likely attaching into this auto pistol unit. This has 6 heavy mining tools in it. Those are 2 attack, strength 5, AP2, 3 damage melee weapons with anti-vehicle 4 up. So adding some very, very good sort of armor cracking to the list if we really want to. We have a couple of units of Hand Flamer Acolytes, 3 Hand Flamer Acolyte units, as well as a Neophyte Hybrid unit to act as utility. 1 Goliath Truck to bring either them or the melee Acolytes into the fight, alongside 3 units of Aberrants to deliver the Abominants. 3 Achilles Ridge Runners. It's interestingly 3 individual Achilles Ridge Runners, so we have 3 potential instances of crossfire. 2 of those are equipped with spotters to give them +1 to hit, so they can more accurately land their heavy mortar shots in order to get that crossfire effect on enemies, as one with a Survey Auger in order to remove cover from enemies. Just in case we are trying to get some range damage out, it doesn't appear that we have a ton of shooting in the army. The Goliath Truck does have a little bit of shooting attached, and the Ridge Runners themselves are also pretty good at shooting. So I imagine that this is for stripping cover from a light enemy infantry squad, for example, that we could just clear out that's potentially trying to screen and hit it with all the mortars, also hit it with the potentially heavy stubbers and the shooting from the trucks before maybe killing it with flamers or something. So you can kind of use that to clear out light units that are preventing your deep strikers, like your Aberrants, from coming in, benefiting from the charge bonuses that the detachment grants you, and getting actually stuck into their hard targets. These Ridge Runners, the crossfire effects on them does affect melee attacks, unlike many of these +1 AP effects in the game. So it is going to be a huge bonus to all of these melee units once they get into melee there. We also have a unit of hybrid metamorphs in order to attach that second Biophagus, who does remove Scout from the unit, unfortunately, because he himself doesn't Scout. But because they then get the bonus attack from the detachment ability, these guys actually hit extremely hard once they get into melee, especially once you've comboed them out with the Ridge Runners as well. We also then have 15 Pure Strain Genestealers, 3 units of 5, one of them to attach with the Patriarch into. The Patriarch unit's a little bit more of a power lifter. The rest of the units can jump in, use their speed and infiltrate to block out enemy infiltrators, remove enemy screens in the early game so that you can come in with the melee bricks like the Metamorphs and like the Aberrants and clean house in the late game. Pretty standard variety of Biosanctic Brood Surge, but it's definitely an extremely cool detachment, and it's also cool to see that so many Genestealer Cult detachments are super playable out of the Codex now. It took them a couple of updates to get there, but finally we are seeing not only Biosanctic Brood Surge do well, but we've also been seeing some success from Outlander Claw and even Ascension Host in other events elsewhere in this update season. Now, moving on from that, we are coming back to the Gem City GT for the last of our undefeated players here, Brian Doherty, who went undefeated with World Eaters. Now, this is a faction that didn't necessarily get the same level of buffs as we saw from things like Genestealer Cults. This list in particular was rocking Angron, Lord Invocatus, as well as a Master of Executions with the Berserker Glaive, 2 units of Jackals, 1 big unit of 10 Khorne Berserkers to jump in that Master of Executions into. He can act as a pretty good deterrent for melee counterpunches, obviously, because he grants you fight first, and then he can heroically intervene with this whole unit, hit you with just a billion attacks, and kill you. So if Angron commits in and you're trying to kill Angron with a unit of aggressors, some defensive melee unit that you're going to try to counterattack him with, you can just place these guys into a position where they can come in and hit you, and basically dissuade you from ever being able to do that. We have 1 World Eater's Rhino to get them up into the fight. We also have 2 units of 8 bound, 1 unit of 6 Exalted 8 bound, 1 unit of 3 Exalted 8 bound, and 1 unit of 2 Chaos Spawn to act as utility. Honestly, pretty standard World Eater stuff, although for a faction with an index as short as it is, that's not too surprising. Now we're moving on to the Winchester GT. This was a 36-player GT held over in good old England, and this was won by Orks. I'm actually really excited to take a peek at this army because Orks in the new update, I feel like are a little underbaked, and we haven't seen how they've been succeeding so far. Now, this is a War Horde detachment, so essentially the index release detachment. It is rocking Ghazghkull Thraka, 2 beast bosses, as well as triple war bosses, plus 2 units of 10 beast snagga boys to drop those beast bosses into, 1 unit of 10 boys, 3 units of 5 flash kits to add a little bit of shooting to the army to give it the opportunity to clear out screens before the screens can prevent the orcs from coming in on their WA turn and doing terrible stuff to you. I think orc lists, kind of like World Eaters lists, do benefit in some instances from a little bit of shooting, and the flash kits definitely give you some very efficient shooting profiles for their cost. They're also not too bad at melee, actually. They just are like an orc boy with a choppa, which is definitely never bad, especially on the WA turn. We have 3 units of Gretchen, as well as 2 mega knobs to jump in with Ghazghkull Thraka, 3 units of knobs to attach with the regular orc when war bosses, 2 units of storm boys, and a bunch of trucks to bring it all to the fight. 5 trucks in total. So we have enough trucks to get all of the knobs in, as well as all of the beast snagga boys, and potentially even the flash kits as well if we're jumping in them too. And the trucks also, the other benefit that you have there is that the trucks are oftentimes good staging points for these units. They can jump out a unit on the WA turn, use it to run forward and do orky things, and then have another unit reload into the truck for then the truck to move and disembark it on a future turn, or simply disembark and charge onto a central objective and sort of follow up the main orc offensive later on in the turn. So these truck-based orc lists are incredibly popular. There's really no reason for them to be going anywhere. This is honestly mostly standard orc stuff. I'm a little sad not to see things like kill rigs and some of the new technology from the new update, but obviously if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Why would we change the classic War Horde if it's already been doing fairly well throughout the length of the previous season? Now we're moving on to the West Allotment at War, RTT. This was registered as an RTT or listed as an RTT, but it is a 2-day 5-round event. So a basically GT style event. It did run 23 players, so on the smaller side, but definitely not tiny. It was won by Eddie Chatter, who was rocking Leagues of Votann, taking a Brokir Iron Master as well as a single Einhir champion with Appraising Glare. The army had 2 units of Hearthkin warriors in it, alongside 4 Sagittars, a unit of 6 Brokir Thunderkin, which is probably jumping into the Hecatan Land Fortress. We can kind of see peeking out there from the bottom. So I guess it's still unlikely that we are attaching the Brokir Iron Master into the Thunderkin unit. That is an attachment he's allowed, but oftentimes doesn't get used. He just uses an independent body with a bunch of wounds, because those Brokir Thunderkin can't actually fit into any transports if you're not bringing him with them. Sometimes they can strategic reserve, and they're pretty good coming off the table edge, but a lot of times you do actually want to bring them to the fight with the land fortresses. We have 3 units of Chthonian Berserks. Those guys can potentially jump into the Sagittars, alongside 3 big units of Hernkin Pioneers, 1 unit of 6, 2 units of 3, and a unit of Hernkin Jaegers to take up the middle of the table. So we have a lot of scouting action. The big unit of 6 Hernkin Pioneers can really wall enemies in. We have 2 units of 3 that can act as, I guess, sort of utility units, but also keep the heat off of the center of the table. That's also supported by 4 Sagittars, all of which can scout move. We can potentially be splitting up a couple of Hearthkin Warriors in those Sagittars as well, so we get additional unit activations that way. Plus, we have the Hecatan Land Fortress either carrying Chthonian Berserks, which it can do if the Sagittars are splitting up the Hearthkin Warriors, or bringing that unit of Brokir Thunderkin. Obviously, the Iron Master can jump in with the Thunderkin unit if they are not embarking into the Land Fortress. But however it gets used, we have basically a huge amount of forward operation that can clear a lot of space for that Land Fortress to dominate the middle of the table, and alongside a very strong counterpunch from all of those Chthonian Berserks, because by the time they get into melee, you're probably going to have a bunch of judgment tokens on you, and that is not where you want to be. We also have the Singleton 9 here champion too with the Praising Glare, which is a cute inclusion as well. He doesn't really have that many attachments he can jump into, but oftentimes they're just taken by themselves as a little bit of a counterpunch beat stick. Now moving over to the Risky Rollers Open. Now, as I mentioned before, this is an incredibly long event held down in Victoria, Australia, and it played theoretically 8 rounds, but I don't believe the last round ever got played. They did cut it at 7, and Reese Cunningham went undefeated with a total of 7 wins on his record. What a ridiculous showing from this one. Although I believe that we are only in the 40s for a total player count. Yeah, it looks like 44 actually registered players over the course of the event, but Reese did defeat them all over the course of 7 rounds. This was running basically a classic Bringers of the Flame detachment that we've talked about a million times on both the series and the channel because it's incredibly strong. Obviously a little less strong now that the faction has been significantly depowered by points changes, but still I think in the running. We've got Morvenval, we've got St. Celestine, we've got 2 Immolators alongside 3 Castigators, 2 of those equipped with battle cannons, which are a little bit better early on before you start applying the debuffs to the target units later in the chain. So the battle cannon Castigators are good in a couple of instances. When they're the first thing to shoot, they're usually pretty effective. They then are pretty good at applying the buff for other units and still getting damage because they essentially are AP2 because the battle cannon is ignoring cover. The Castigator autocannon then is the recipient of the buff essentially to then get wound rerolls on the target, benefit from that +1 AP, potentially ignore cover from an Immolator, and really just go to town on someone. We have 2 Dominion squads with Meltaguns, pretty classic technology there, alongside 2 Exorcists, which I think are becoming very, very popular within the Sisters community. These things you can just pop a bunch of missile shots off, either indirect or just firing directly. Having a random damage weapon with Miracle Dice available to you means that basically any failed save from these things can and probably is lethal, especially once the Triumph of St. Catherine is padding your Miracle Pool. We have a big unit of Paragon Warsuits who are more involved to jump into, who acts as kind of a protector of the backline shooting battery. We have the 2 Exorcists and the 3 Castigators sitting oftentimes on the Sororitas table edge and just firing enormous numbers of shots downrange. Anything that comes close to them gets picked up by the Paragon Warsuits if it's able to get through the Dominion squads. We also then have a Seraphim squad for utility. It doesn't look like we have any Immolators. Oh, excuse me, that's entirely wrong. We have 2 Immolators in the unit, in the army. So those can combat squad out the Dominions as well. So we can take the 4 Meltaguns plus all the bolt guns in the other unit. The bolt guns can sit on a back objective and chill for the entirety of the game, whereas the Meltaguns move forward, shoot someone. If they come back to attack them, they react to move back into the Immolator. You can often kill the Immolator, but then the Dominions pop out the other side, and it's hard to actually kill them. So they're just so much value for their points, as well as getting that ignore cover, which can then benefit the backline shooting as well. So 7 total Adeptus Sororitas tanks, plus the 2 Dominion squads and Morvenval's unit. Plus we have a little bit of late game punch and disruption as well from St. Celestine. There isn't a Triumph of St. Catherine, it's important to note, so we don't have the synergy with Bringers of the Flame with +1 movement and the bonus advanced roll, but you can see you have so much space inside a Sisters army once you take the Triumph out that it's definitely possible to do fairly well. Without them, we're just taking a bunch of really good Sisters data sheets, which is pretty solid. And clearly, it was good enough to win 7 consecutive games of 40k, so can't complain too much about that. Now, we are moving over to our final event and our final list of the week here, folks. We're going to go over to the Kirtonian Total Carnage 6. This was won by Jonathan Summerfield, rocking Chaos Space Marines. Jonathan was taking a Renegade Raiders detachment, so the pretty classic Chaos Space Marine detachment that we all know and love. He's even called his list Old Reliable. Fair enough. We've got a Chaos Lord with Mark of the Hound to give his unit scout. We've got Cypher in there to tax enemy command points. Fabius Bile to act as an independent operator. He's incredibly hard to kill, can blank damage, can regenerate himself. He's just a good dude, I guess. A Cultist Mob, 3 Chaos Rhinos to carry around all our infantry, 3 Predator Destructors to act as backline shooting, 2 big units of Chosen. Now, one thing that we've been seeing occur a little bit more often here is actually Fabius Bile jumping into one of the Chosen units. Oftentimes, you will leave these guys alone, but Fabius Bile does give them +1 strength and toughness, which is kind of a big deal for them. Plus, he's not too bad at melee himself. It's nice if he gets his ability to advance and charge. And getting him up the table to get into your opponent's face and be annoying to kill is also pretty good. We then have 2 units of Hapics to jump into that last Rhino. One of them with las cannons to punch down heavier targets, one with auto cannons to bully heavy infantry. Both of those can benefit from all of the detachment synergies when you disembark from a transport, which is huge. And then we have 2 units of Warp Talons as well. Interestingly, only 5 model Warp Talon units, so the opportunities that they have to actually kill their opponent are a little bit less consistent than we would get from a 10 model Warp Talon unit, but to be honest, still pretty effective, especially once you start adding the +1 AP from the detachment ability, in addition to the benefits that you get from Dark Pacts as well. These guys do have enough attacks to clear out enemy utility units and jump back into reserve to constantly bounce in and out of the fight. And with that, those are all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comment section which one is your favorite. Also, let me know down in the comment section what you think about this format. This format makes it much more possible for me to make these videos, so I hope that it is okay. I know it is a downgrade from the previous incarnation of the series. If you have any comments or criticisms or things that you would like to change to improve the legibility of these videos, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports me either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. I love you all. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.